For 400 years, the story of New York has been told through its shimmering skyscrapers, its legendary millionaires, and its neon lights. But there is another city, a city built on poisoned ground, fueled by the blood of desperate immigrants and the cold indifference of the powerful. This is the New York of the shadows, places where the rules were different, where the police didn't go, and where life was the cheapest commodity on the market. Imagine the stench, the suffocating mix of unwashed bodies, raw sewage, and the damp rot of the earth. While the mansions of Fifth Avenue were rising toward the clouds, the basements of Mulberry Street were swallowing lives whole. From the toxic, forgotten swamps of the 1700s to the burning ruins of the South Bronx in the 1970s, we are going on a journey through the most dangerous neighborhoods in American history. We aren't looking at the postcards or the walking tours. We're looking at the real thing. Using AI reconstructions based on forgotten maps, police archives, and first-hand accounts, we've rebuilt the worlds that the city tried to pave over. This is the dark anatomy of Gotham. And to understand how it became so lethal, we have to start where the ground itself was cursed. Before New York was a forest of steel and glass, it was a city defined by its water. In the heart of what we now call Lower Manhattan, there once sat a 48-acre oasis known as the Collect Pond. For nearly a century, this spring-fed, 60-foot-deep lake was the soul of the settlement, a source of crystal-clear drinking water for every resident. It was a place of beauty, surrounded by rolling hills where New Yorkers went to skate in the winter and picnic in the summer. But as the city's population exploded, the Collect Pond became a victim of its own success. By the late 1700s, the lake had been transformed from a life-giving spring into a biological weapon. The hills surrounding the pond became home to the city's most brutal industries. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, and breweries took root on its banks, and they treated the water like a bottomless trash can. Every single day, thousands of gallons of heavy metal waste, sulfuric acid, and animal carcasses were dumped directly into the lake. Slaughterhouses poured rivers of blood and rotting offal down the slopes. By 1800, the crystal-clear water was gone. In its place was a thick, stagnant soup of toxic sludge, covered in a shimmering film of chemical grease. The stench was so foul, so thick with the smell of death and rot, that property values around the pond collapsed. Anyone with the means to leave fled north. In 1811, the city government decided they had seen enough, but their solution was a fatal mistake. They didn't clean the pond, they tried to bury it. They dug a canal to drain the water into the Hudson River, a path that today we know as Canal Street, and then spent years filling the massive depression with dirt, street sweepings, and rubble. But you cannot bury a ghost. The ground they created was a geological disaster. It was waterlogged, unstable, and perpetually sinking. Because the land was cheap and the air was still heavy with the scent of industrial waste, the wealthy never returned. Instead, they left behind a swamp of toxic mud. On this unstable, poisoned foundation, speculators began throwing up cheap, wooden tenements as fast as they could hammer the nails. These buildings were never meant to last. They were built to fail, and they were built for the people the city didn't want to see. As the heavy wooden structures began to tilt into the soft earth and the basements flooded with black, sulfurous water, the stage was set for the birth of a legend. The Collect Pond was gone. In its place, the 5 Points was rising. By the 1830s, the world had a new name for hell on earth: 5 Points. The name itself was literal, derived from the sharp, 5-cornered intersection where Anthony, Cross, and Orange Streets collided. Today, if you visit Columbus Park in Chinatown, you are standing on the very spot where the rules of civilization once ceased to exist. If you've seen Hollywood's Gangs of New York, you've seen a sanitized, cinematic version of this place. The reality was far more claustrophobic. By the mid-19th century, 5 Points had become the densest neighborhood in the entire Western Hemisphere. Think about that for a second. In an era before skyscrapers, before steel frames, thousands of people were packed into a few square blocks with a density that rivals modern-day Hong Kong or Manila. The population was a desperate cocktail of humanity. Irish refugees fleeing the Great Famine, newly freed Black Americans moving north, and waves of Italian and German immigrants. They were all squeezed into wooden tenements that were literally rotting from the bottom up. Remember the collect pond. The ground was still sinking. Buildings tilted at impossible angles. Doors wouldn't close because the frames were warped. Stairs would suddenly collapse into flooded basements. Landlords, driven by pure greed, took single-family houses and subdivided them. Then they subdivided them again. They partitioned rooms with thin sheets of cloth or scrap wood until an entire family of 8 was living in a space no larger than a modern walk-in closet. There was no running water, no such thing as a bathroom. Instead, residents shared a single privy in the backyard, a shallow hole in the ground that frequently overflowed into the streets during the rain. The air was a thick, yellow haze of coal smoke, cooking grease, and the overwhelming stench of raw sewage. But it wasn't just the smell that made 5 Points legendary. It was the chaos. The streets were unpaved, filled with knee-deep mud and roaming packs of feral pigs. These pigs were the city's only garbage disposal system. They ate the waste thrown from windows, and in turn they became a constant threat to the small children playing in the gutters. In 5 Points, the sun rarely hit the pavement. The alleys were so narrow and the buildings so packed together that life happened in a perpetual, damp twilight. It was a pressure cooker of ethnic tension, starvation, and disease. And in the center of this nightmare stood a building so dark, so violent, that even the most hardened criminals whispered its name with fear. If 5 Points was the heart of New York's darkness, the Old Brewery was the rotting center of that heart. Originally built as a massive beer factory in the late 1700s, it stood directly on the 5 Points intersection. But by the 1830s, the beer was gone, replaced by a concentrated hive of human misery. At its peak, this single building housed over 1,000 people, not in apartments, but in a vertical fortress of crime. The statistics from this era are chilling. It is estimated that for 15 straight years, the Old Brewery averaged 1 murder every single week. Inside its pitch-black corridors, like the infamous Murderer's Alley, life was the cheapest commodity available. Men were stabbed for their boots. Women were strangled for a handful of copper coins. The police simply refused to enter. If a body was found in the hallway, it often stayed there for days until someone bothered to drag it out to the street. The architecture of the brewery had become a literal maze of survival. Former industrial vats were converted into communal sleeping pits where 30 people would huddle in the dark. The basement, perpetually flooded with toxic groundwater, became known as the Den of Thieves. It was a network of secret passages and underground tunnels that allowed criminals to vanish into the earth the moment a rare police patrol appeared on the horizon. But the violence wasn't just random, it was tribal. This was the era of the first great American street gangs. Groups with names that sounded like dark fairy tales, the Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, and the Plug Uglies. They didn't fight for grand ideals, they fought for blocks. They fought for the right to breathe in a world that had forgotten them. Armed with paving stones, brass knuckles, and heavy wooden clubs, they turned the intersection into a permanent war zone. In the draft riots of 1863, this tension finally boiled over into 4 days of pure, unadulterated chaos. Over 100 people were killed in the streets. An orphanage for black children was burned to the ground. It was the largest civil insurrection in American history, and it started right here, in the mud of 5 Points. The city eventually demolished the brewery in 1852, but they didn't kill the darkness. The underworld didn't disappear, it just migrated. It moved a few blocks east to a mile-long strip of neon and nightmares where the lights were brighter, but the shadows were even longer. Just a few blocks east of the rotting ruins of 5 Points lay the Bowery. If 5 Points was a sudden violent death, the Bowery was a long, slow decay. By the Civil War era, this mile-long strip had transformed into America's first true Skid Row, a gauntlet of saloons, dance halls, pawn shops, and flop houses. It was the place where the broken and the forgotten washed up when they had nowhere else to go. At night, the Bowery was a sea of gaslight and shadows, attracting sailors, drifters, and anyone looking for the cheapest whiskey in Manhattan. But behind the flickering lights was an economy built on pure, concentrated desperation. For 7 cents a night, you could rent a small wooden cubicle. For 5 cents, a spot on a canvas hammock in a room packed with 50 other sweating men. But if you were truly at the bottom, if you only had 2 pennies to your name, you paid for the 2-cent hangover. Imagine this. You aren't allowed to lie down. Instead, you pay 2 cents to sit on a wooden bench all night. A thick, coarse rope is stretched horizontally across the bench at chest height. You lean forward, resting your weight and your chin against the rope to keep from collapsing onto the floor. You sleep hanging there, like laundry on a line. In the morning, the valet wouldn't wake you up with a kind word. He would simply take a knife and cut the rope. Dozens of exhausted, half-conscious men would slam onto the floor simultaneously. That was your alarm clock. This was the world that photojournalist Jacob Riis discovered in the 1890s. Armed with a primitive flash camera that emitted a terrifying bang and a cloud of white smoke, Riis captured what the wealthy elites on Wall Street, less than a mile away, refused to believe existed. His book, How the Other Half Lives, showed children huddled for warmth on sidewalk gratings and 12-person families living in windowless cellars, where the walls literally oozed damp rot. Riis's photographs were a shock to the American conscience. They proved that the Bowery wasn't just a place of sin, it was a factory of human misery. But while the reformers began to argue about how to fix the Bowery, a new and even more disciplined brand of danger was hardening on the city's western edge. If the Bowery was where you went to disappear, our next stop was where you went to be disappeared by the most ruthless gangs the city had ever seen. If you walked west toward the Hudson River in the late 19th century, the air changed. The smell of rotting garbage was replaced by the scent of salt water, coal smoke, and cheap Irish whiskey. You had entered Hell's Kitchen. Running from 34th to 59th Street, west of 8th Avenue, this wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a fortress. The name says it all. Legend has it that a veteran cop, watching a small-scale riot on 39th Street, remarked to his partner, "This place is hell itself." His partner replied, "Hell's a mild climate. This is Hell's Kitchen." For nearly a century, this area was the private kingdom of the Irish gangs. It began with the dock worker gangs who controlled the piers. Back then, the Manhattan waterfront was the busiest in the world, and the gangs were the gatekeepers of the American dream. If you wanted to work the docks to feed your family, you didn't go to a foreman. You went to the gang leader who controlled your pier. You paid a portion of your wages as tribute. If you refused, you didn't work. If you complained to the authorities, you might find yourself at the bottom of the Hudson with your pockets full of stones. This was the home turf of New York's most cold-blooded criminals. Men like Oni the Killer Madden, who ran a bootlegging empire from these streets during Prohibition. Madden was so feared that he reportedly had a private box at the Stork Club where even the most powerful politicians had to ask permission to speak to him. The reputation of Hell's Kitchen was so terrifying that the NYPD established a pairs-only rule. No officer was allowed to patrol these blocks alone. To enter Hell's Kitchen with a badge was to enter a world where every window held a potential sniper, and every alleyway was a trap. But there was a darker side to the danger here. It was organized. Unlike the chaotic violence of 5 Points, Hell's Kitchen operated on a strict lethal code. Mind your business. Pay your dues. Keep your mouth shut. It was a community bound by a law of silence that was stronger than any constitutional right. People lived, worked, and died within these 10 blocks without ever speaking a single word to a government official. It was a world of shadows and secrets. But while Hell's Kitchen was defined by its silence, our next stop was defined by its noise. The deafening roar of millions of people packed so tightly together that the very air became a luxury they couldn't afford. By the 1880s, if you were to look at a heat map of human existence on Earth, the brightest, hottest spot wouldn't be London, Paris, or Tokyo. It would be a few square miles on the edge of Manhattan known as the Lower East Side. This was the immigrant processing center of the world, a gateway for Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, Italians, and Chinese immigrants. But that gateway was more like a pressure cooker. To understand the danger here, you have to understand the numbers. Modern-day Manhattan is one of the most crowded places on the planet, averaging about 70,000 people per square mile. In the Lower East Side in the 1890s, that number skyrocketed to over 330,000 people per square mile. In some blocks, the density was so high that if everyone stepped out onto the street at the same time, they would be standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to move. People weren't just living here, they were being consumed by the architecture. The dumbbell tenements were designed to pack as many bodies as possible into a single lot. Rooms were windowless. The only source of fresh air was a narrow air shaft between buildings, a space so tight you could touch both brick walls with your outstretched arms. These shafts quickly became vertical trash cans, filled with rotting food and human waste, turning the very air people breathed into a toxic fog. But the real danger wasn't just the disease. It was the greed that turned these homes into factories. This was the world of the sweatshop. Families of 10 would sew clothing for 14 hours a day in the same cramped room where they ate and slept. This culture of neglect reached a horrific climax on March 25, 1911, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. When a fire broke out on the upper floors, the workers, mostly young immigrant women, found the exit doors locked from the outside. The owners had locked them to prevent unauthorized breaks or theft. Trapped by the flames, 146 people died. Many chose to jump from the 9th floor windows rather than burn alive, hitting the pavement in front of horrified onlookers. The Triangle Fire changed American labor laws forever, but it was only possible because, for decades, the Lower East Side had been treated as a place where human life was secondary to profit. It was a neighborhood where you could be killed by a fire, a fever, or a falling building before you ever saw the sun. But as the 20th century progressed, the danger in New York began to shift. It moved north, away from the crowded tenements, and into a neighborhood that was once the cultural crown jewel of the city, only to be systematically dismantled by the very people sworn to protect it. While the Lower East Side was a battle against overcrowding, Harlem was a battle against abandonment. To understand the danger of Harlem, you have to understand the tragic arc of its history. In the 1920s, this was the cultural crown jewel of Black America. It was the era of the Harlem Renaissance, the birthplace of modern jazz, the home of legendary poets, and a global symbol of Black excellence. But by the 1960s, the lights of the Apollo Theater were flickering against a backdrop of systemic decay. The danger here wasn't accidental. It was engineered through a policy known as redlining. For decades, banks and the federal government literally drew red lines around Harlem on maps, marking it as hazardous for investment. Loans were denied, insurance was withheld, and the neighborhood was systematically starved of capital. As the tax base eroded, city services followed. Trash sat uncollected for weeks. Hospitals and schools were left to rot. By the 1970s, Harlem began to look like a city under siege. Landlords, unable to sell their deteriorating properties or even pay the taxes, turned to a horrific alternative: arson for profit. They would hire torchers to burn their own buildings down to collect the insurance money, often while the tenants were still sleeping inside. Entire blocks of beautiful brownstones were reduced to hollowed-out blackened shells, their windows bricked up like blind eyes. Then came the 1980s, and with it, the crack cocaine epidemic. It was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. The street-level violence reached a fever pitch. By 1990, the murder rate in Harlem was nearly 10 times the national average. 125th Street, once the vibrant heart of the community, became synonymous with open-air drug markets where the sound of gunfire was as common as the rumble of the subway. For the families who stayed because they had nowhere else to go, survival meant living in a state of constant high alert, teaching their children to sleep in bathtubs or on the floor to avoid stray bullets passing through thin walls. Harlem hadn't just become dangerous. It had been abandoned by the city, left to burn in the shadows of its former glory. But while Harlem was being hollowed out from the inside, the South Bronx was facing a total fiery apocalypse. If 5 Points was the most dangerous square mile of the 19th century, the South Bronx held that cursed title for the 20th. By the mid-1970s, the South Bronx wasn't just a neighborhood in decline, it was a neighborhood in flames. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal, daily apocalypse. Between 1970 and 1980, the South Bronx averaged an unbelievable 12,000 fires per year. That is more than 30 fires every single day. The sky was permanently stained with thick, black smoke. Why? Because the system had decided the South Bronx was worth more dead than alive. Landlords, trapped by falling property values, hired professional arsonists to torch their own buildings for insurance payouts. The city responded by cutting services, closing firehouses, and leaving the residents, mostly Black and Latino families, to fight the infernos with garden hoses and buckets of water. The devastation was so total that when President Jimmy Carter visited Charlotte Street in 1977, he stood in front of miles of rubble and compared it to a bombed-out city in post-war Berlin. 3 years later, Ronald Reagan stood on the same spot for a photo op, promising change that never came. By the time the fires finally stopped, the South Bronx had lost 80% of its housing stock. Over 300,000 people were displaced. Entire census tracts showed population drops of 90%. It was the greatest urban disaster in American history that wasn't caused by a natural catastrophe. But here is the part the history books often miss. In the midst of this urban war zone, among the ruins and the abandoned lots, something miraculous happened. On August 11, 1973, at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, a young man named D.J. Kool Herc threw a back-to-school party. He used 2 turntables to isolate the break in the record, creating a continuous loop of rhythm. In a world where they had no instruments, no funding, and no support, the youth of the South Bronx used what they had: electricity from street lamps and records from their parents' collections. Hip-hop was born not in a studio but in the wreckage. Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bambaataa, the Rock Steady Crew, they transformed the most dangerous landscape in America into a global cultural powerhouse. They proved that while the city could burn their buildings, it couldn't burn their soul. The South Bronx was a warning of what happens when a city eats its own, but it was also a testament to human resilience. But as the 90s approached, the danger took on a new, shiny, and far more commercial mask. To see the final transformation, we have to go back to the center of it all, to a place every tourist knows, but few truly remember. Today, if you stand at the intersection of 42nd Street and Broadway, you are at the crossroads of the world. You are surrounded by massive LED screens, costumed characters taking photos with tourists, and the headquarters of the world's most powerful corporations. It is the safest, most visited, and most profitable intersection in Manhattan. But for those who knew New York in the 1970s and 80s, this Disney-fication is the ultimate plot twist. Because back then, Times Square was the most dangerous block in America. 42nd Street, known then as the Deuce, was a neon-lit gauntlet of pornographic theaters, peep shows, and grindhouses. The sidewalks weren't filled with tourists. They were littered with used needles and broken glass. Muggings were so frequent that the NYPD essentially gave up on the area after dark. It was a place where the city's darkness was on full display, unfiltered and unapologetic. The transformation that began in the 1990s was one of the most aggressive urban makeovers in history. Through a combination of broken windows policing, corporate tax breaks, and a massive influx of private capital, the grit was scrubbed away. The theaters were demolished, the criminals were pushed out, and the neon was replaced by corporate logos. Is Times Square better now? Physically, yes. It's safer, it's cleaner, but many New Yorkers will tell you that in the process of killing the danger, the city also killed a part of its soul. The weirdness, the edge, the unpredictable energy that made New York was paved over to make room for a souvenir shop. As we look back at the 400-year history of these neighborhoods, from the toxic mud of the Collect Pond to the burning tenements of the South Bronx, a clear pattern emerges. Every single dangerous neighborhood we've explored was dangerous because those in power decided that certain lives were disposable. The Irish immigrants, the black families, the garment workers, they were all forced into these zones of neglect. New York has always been 2 cities, one city of monuments and brochures, and another city of shadows and forgotten streets. We remember these places not to celebrate the violence, but to honor the people who survived them. Because the history of New York isn't just written by its billionaires, it's written by the people who lived in the basements of Mulberry Street and the ruins of the Bronx. Some things are worth remembering, especially the things they wanted you to forget. Thanks for watching Time Warp Cities. If you enjoyed this deep dive into New York's forgotten streets, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Which city's dark history should we explore next? As always, we'll see you in the next era.